Welcome, everybody, to the C Suite Sherpas Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Marshall. On our podcast, we shine a spotlight on great resources for the C Suite. And speaking of great resources, we've got one here today. John Matthews. John, tell us about your company and who you work with.
Well, my company's been around for coming up on 21 years, called Gray Cat Enterprises. I do basically three things and have over the last 20 plus years. I do senior project management. So think of a company that has a project, but they don't have a body that they can throw at it, generally a VP or executive VP level. And they'll bring me in for a period of time to manage that particular project. I'll do some strategic planning for companies that want to scale. I've been fortunately in my corporate world, been with some heavy scaling companies, Little Caesars growing, Jimmy John's growing, Clark growing, that I can help these companies go from 10 units to 100 units, somewhere along those lines. And then the third area, and this is the area that I just love doing the most, is being an interim executive manager. Company goes out and buys a division, they don't have anyone to run it, or the division is in trouble and they need someone to go in and kind of clean it up. I think I've done 11 of these assignments, both as a chief operating officer and a chief marketing officer. I just completed one with Destination Pet last year. I was the CMO for 6 months. And I go in and spend 6 months to, in some cases, 3 years, actually being the interim guy that goes in, cleans things up, and positions them for a full-time person to come on board. So that's kind of fun to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about being an operational management consultant, and a lot of people use the word fractional executive. Is there a difference between what you do and what fractional executives do, or is it pretty much the same thing?
That is the challenge that I face when I say I'm a management consultant, because a lot of people think that it's, oh, you're just going to create some mumbo jumbo and I'm going to get a folder and I'm going to put it on my shelf. I'm never going to implement it. I position myself as an operational guy. I roll up the sleeves, I get in, I solve the problems, I manage the project, I run a division, very hands-on management consultant.
Yeah, and I appreciate that because I spent most of my career, 40 years, running companies, starting companies, exiting. Not all the exits were successful. One of them was a catastrophic failure, bankruptcy. You haven't lived if you haven't been bankrupt. So I went through some tough exits as well as a really successful exit. One thing I hated about consultants was that the only guarantee they gave you is that you're going to pay their invoices. And the rest is like, hey, I hope it works out for you. I love that hands-on approach. You're right. I had, a trophy case full of strategy plans and operational guides that never got executed, and we would dust them off every so often. We call them bookshelf trophies. So I love the fact that you're a doer and you like to get things done and roll up your sleeves. So you're working with a company, and one of the things you mentioned offline before we started was you love to work with companies that are in scale mode. And I own a SaaS software company that we're in scale mode, so I can relate to this, right? So tell me what you would do. Somebody's like, hey, we need to scale from 3 locations to 6, or in our case, we want to scale to $1 million ARR for 2025. What would cause me to reach out to you and say, hey, John, I need your help? So what does that look like typically?
I've been very fortunate in some of my corporate jobs to be with some high growth companies. To put things in perspective, I joined Little Caesars when they had 1,300 locations, and 5 years later, we had 5,000 locations. And if you do the math real quick, that's like adding a store and a half a day. And my job was, I was a manager trainee at Little Caesars when I started. 5 years later, I was the national marketing director. I had 1,600 locations. I had 35 markets throughout the United States. I had 35 marketing managers. And I told them, if you're not reinventing yourself every 6 months, this train is just going to run you right over. Because if you think you can go from 20 units to 40 units, and the way you're going to get there is working twice as hard, you're going to get run over by this train. You have to figure out smarter ways to market to those 40 locations than what you were doing with the 20 locations. Having gone through that in an operational sense at Jimmy John's with the same type of growth there, where I was the chief operating officer and president, and from a marketing perspective at Little Caesars, I can help smaller companies peek around the corner to go, if we go from 10 locations to 50 locations, what does that mean? Well, your infrastructure's got to change. The way you manage invoices has to change. You have to scale with the amount of stores that you have. That's the perspective I bring from those corporate roles where I was front and center in managing the scale, and how you apply it to smaller locations. Private equity firms like to bring me into their startup companies because I can work hand in hand with the CEO of that smaller company and give them that type of knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking you are the true definition of a Sherpa. This whole podcast is designed to find folks that guide people in the C-suite to a place they've never been before. Definition of a great Sherpa is somebody who's been up to the top of Mount Everest and back. They know exactly what to bring, but more importantly, they know what not to bring. And
Right.
so that's no surprise that private equity folks would love you because they don't want to see someone fail on their dime. Fail. They don't want to be the greatest lesson you've ever learned on their dime, right? They want you to
Right.
be successful, and a successful Sherpa brings you to the top and back. That's just to put it in context. That's why we do what we do, because we're looking for folks to shine a spotlight on that can help the C-suite. So if you're thinking about scaling your business, I'd encourage you to reach out to John. We're going to make sure we give you John's contact information before we're done here today. A couple more questions and then we'll shift gears. What are the challenges? Everyone talks about scale. I'm in the software business. We want to massively scale this. What are the challenges that you're seeing in the marketplace around scalability for someone who's thinking about taking their company to a whole nother level?
The acceptance that things have to change. That's probably the biggest hurdle. I have to accept the fact that if I go from 10 locations to 100 locations, we're both from Chicago. Maybe I'm going to go from 10 locations in Chicago to 100 locations in the Midwest. So now I'm in 5 different states or 10 different states. I have to accept that I can't be 20 minutes away from every one of my locations. If something happens in a location in Iowa, I got to rely on someone else to be able to deal with that location. So that's probably the biggest thing is how do I release my control over this enterprise? Am I comfortable in doing that? Do I have the personnel, the systems, the procedures, the processes in place that enable me to manage it from afar as effectively as I'm managing it up close and personal? That's probably the biggest hurdle. And once you get past that, once you're okay, and I use the term heading into the abyss, once you're okay going into the abyss, then it's okay. You can manage it. I worked at Clark and White Hen Pantry in Chicago. I was the head of 5 different divisions there for a $3 billion company in my corporate days. And I remember I went in as a marketing person to that organization, and the CEO and the COO gave me facilities management at one point. That meant that I was in charge of 1,400 locations, environmental, purchasing, repair. I didn't have a clue what that was. And they threw me into the abyss. And I figured it out after about 6 months. I go, I can figure that out. And so a year later, they gave me all the real estate associated with that. Once you get used to breaking down that paradigm, you go, it's okay. The boogeyman isn't as bad as I thought he was, and I can handle this. Then I'm okay learning how to scale it more effectively and more efficiently.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments because change is something that we intuitively fight as human beings. We like to be in our comfort zone. And I tell my clients all the time, you got to get uncomfortable with being comfortable. Because if you're comfortable, you're dying. You're actually falling behind because things are changing so rapidly and so intensely that the only thing that's a constant today is change. Adaptability is what I look for in potential clients, because if they can adapt, let go of things that work to basically do things that they haven't proven but they need to do, then they've got a fighting chance. But they need a good guy. They need a guy like you to help them take them through that process.
Yeah. Always done it that way, Brian. We've always done it that way.
You have to understand, I worked, my first consulting job was with a railroad company that was celebrating their 125th year in business. And if I heard once, I heard it 1,000 times. You have to understand, Brian, that this is how we do things in the railroad business.
Right. Right.
And they almost went out of business continuing to do the things that stopped working years ago, right? So it's tough. So let's shift gears for a second. We're going to do a thing called the lightning round. It's something a little bit fun, gives us a chance to get to know John. I'm gonna customize this a bit because you're an ex-Chicagoan like me. So how long have you been out of Chicago?
15 years.
Okay, so I'm going to start the lightning round. You ready?
Yep.
So what's the one thing you miss about Chicago?
Deep dish pizza, but I get Lou Malnati's delivered to me, Lou's to go frozen pies. So I've satisfied that need.
Boy, you and I could be brothers from another mother. I order the 6-pack every couple of months, and
There's 6 in my freezer downstairs.
It's always about making room for Lou's. I love that. Okay, coffee or tea?
Coffee.
How about cats or dogs?
Both.
If you can grab one item at the start of the zombie apocalypse, what would it be?
What would it be? Probably my cat and my dog.
What about favorite quote or phrase that you think about often?
80% of life is showing up.
Favorite movie?
Probably Bridge over the River Kwai.
Is there a streaming series that you're binge watching?
Probably past tense. It was Ozark and Breaking Bad.
Okay, bucket list item that you've already accomplished.
I'm going to the Super Bowl.
Which one?
So that's 6 times.
Cool.
So some of the perks of the corporate jobs I had.
The one in New Orleans where there was a team called the Bears playing.
I've been to 2 in New Orleans, but the Bears were not in there.
Not the Bears. Okay. Yeah, that was our dynasty for 1 year.
Yeah. The other bucket list is going to the Masters. Fortunately, I've been able to go there 3 times. To your listeners out there, if you haven't been to the Masters and you have some appreciation for golf, there's nothing like it.
I agree.
Nope.
I agree. Bucket list item that you haven't accomplished yet?
Probably traveling more in Europe and the Norwegian area, but I am scheduling a trip to Switzerland next year, so I'm gonna be headed in that direction, which would be nice.
Last one, biggest obstacle that you've personally had to overcome, and what's one big lesson that you learned from that obstacle?
The biggest obstacle is when you're a sole proprietor, especially considering my corporate career where I had 50 to 100 people directly reporting to me. When you're a sole proprietor, you got to do it all. You got to be a good salesperson, business development. You got to be a guy who can deliver on commitments. You got to make sure that you're getting paid. If your email isn't working, you put on the IT hat. You're developing your website. You're developing your brand. That is probably the biggest obstacle that a lot of sole proprietors don't think about, the varied amount of hats they have to wear. They may be very good at what they're trying to create, but if they're not a salesperson, it doesn't really matter. You got to be a salesperson and go out there. You got to spend time being told no over and over again. And you got to have that discipline that gets you at your desk every morning to keep it going. To me, it's always been the biggest challenge. How do you be everything and get to the promised land? Fortunately, my father and my high school coach beat discipline into my head. I am one of those guys that puts in the time and effort to keep my company going for 20 plus years.
Yeah, that's good wisdom. I appreciate you sharing that. So listen, John, I can spend hours talking to you about just deep dish pizza and the Chicago Bears, but we don't have that kind of time today. So one last thing before we go, people want to reach out to you. They're listening to this or thinking, I think I need someone like John to at least have a conversation with you, to explore whether it might be a good fit for having you work with them. What's the best way for people to reach out to you? And by the way, we'll put this in the description of the video for the audience. If you didn't get a chance to write this down, no worries. So what would that be?
I'll give you 2 ways. I do have a website. It's www.graycatenterprises.com. On there, you're going to see my background. You're going to see case studies of companies that I've done work for as Gray Cat. You'll see my corporate background. I even have 15 online courses there. So if you're interested in improving your time management, there's an online course for that. If you're interested in understanding how you can make more money by scrutinizing your P&L, there's a course for that. There's a merchandising course. There's a leadership course. There's a variety of different courses that are available. So if you go to that website, graycatenterprises.com, it's all there. If you want to reach out to me directly, email is probably the best. It's john.matthews, and that's MATTHEWS @graycatenterprises.com.
Awesome. Like I said, we'll put that in the description. So if you didn't get a chance to write that down or you missed part of it, don't worry. It's in the description of the video you're watching. So, John, appreciate you being on the podcast. It's been a treat to get to know you just a little bit better. And I feel like I've reconnected with one of my brothers from Chicago. So it
Go.
feels good. Happy holidays and thanks again.
Thank you.